Thanks very much, Emily. 50 years involvement with the Maritime Museum from the very first day that it opened at St George's Church on Battery Point way back in 1974. Which reminds me that the museum is run by volunteers. And now is as good a time as any to put in a plug and say, we always need more. So if you've been thinking about it, now is a very good time. Leading into winter, you're not going to be able to do the gardening or anything like that, so why not volunteer for the Maritime Museum? Okay, Hobart in time of war. This, as Emily said, is a photographic look at three wars of the 20th century, the Boer War, the First World War and the Second World War, and their impact on the port of Hobart in various ways. It's also, in a sense, a history of the development of photography, if you like, because I discovered that there are very few photographs taken during the Boer War, a few more during the First World War, and then heaps in the 39-45 conflict, which reflects, I guess, the spread of cameras and the availability of faster film and all of that sort of thing. So there's a subplot, if you like, as well to the story. During the 19th century, Hobart had some limited involvement with warlike activity, principally with this is very sensitive, principally with the Maori Wars in New Zealand. I came across a reference to one of the local vessels, part-time whaling bark, Isabella, carrying Imperial troops, British troops from Hobart to New Zealand and leaving here on the 13th of August 1863. And there were others. And then coming the other way, bringing troops home again, a ship called the Siam arrived in Hobart to great fanfare on the 31st of October 1866. And Hobart's own shipping company, the Tasmanian Steam Navigation Company, chartered a number of its vessels to the Imperial government to carry troops to New Zealand from mainland ports, not from Hobart. The city of Hobart was particularly used for that purpose. But to the Boer War, which just creeps into the 20th century, started in the late 19th, about 1899, I think, and it brought a number of unusual ships to Hobart. One of which you can see here, the Atlantean, as the name implies, operated on the North Atlantic for Leyland Line in peacetime. But she arrived here with a contingent of New South Wales bushmen, as they were called, going off to South Africa, and she was joined in Hobart by a Tasmanian contingent of bushmen, and also loaded horses and stores. That's perhaps a better view. Dunn Street Pier was where the King's Pier Marina is today, right in the centre of Sullivan's Cove. There's a note, there was a note in the press at the time that the New South Wales bushmen were entertained to afternoon tea by society ladies of Hobart, which I imagine they probably would have preferred to go to some of the pubs around the waterfront, but anyway, that was it. Chicago was another vessel that called here during the conflict. She called twice in 1901, first to take troops, and then she came back, as in this photo, to load oats and jam, presumably IXL, for carriage to South Africa. And there were also instances of the troops returning home. This is Harlech Castle, arrived here on the 7th of December 1900 and brought Tasmanian troops back from South Africa. Like Atlantean and Chicago, she was a stranger to Australian waters. She was actually owned by the Union Castle Steamship Company and operated normally between the UK and South Africa. Okay, so then we skip 14 years or so to the outbreak of the Great War. And many German ships were caught in Australian and New Zealand ports and so on by the outbreak of war because they didn't have radio and they relied only on the news reports in the newspapers and so on. Many of them were aware that war was imminent and some made their escape, but this one, the Oberhausen, was caught loading timber at Port Huon, and a naval party was sent down from Hobart to seize the ship. It was a bit like a boy's own adventure because apparently they went down by car. This is 1914, and the car broke down. No, sorry, they on the Huon Road near Longley, a tree had fallen across the road, so they had to stop on one side of it. Fortunately, a bus coming up from the Huon was on the other side, so the officer in charge commandeered the bus in the name of the King, left the passengers on the roadside and took his naval party down to Port Huon, raced up the gangway with sword drawn, to be met by the captain at the top of the gangway, who offered him a glass of schnapps and said, "Let's come into the cabin and discuss the situation." So anyway, Oberhausen was brought up to Hobart and anchored off the Domain, as you can see there, for a while. The crew was interned initially at Triffitt's Point out at Claremont, where there was a military camp as well, and later they were moved to Bruny Island and then repatriated after the war. Oberhausen was taken over by the Commonwealth Government and renamed Boer. And as such, she actually visited Hobart again in the early 1920s and loaded fruit for Britain. The first Tasmanian troops to go to the Great War were embarked aboard the P&O line at Geelong, shown here at the very new Ocean Pier, just been opened, and the ship on the other side, Katuna, was used to load the horses and stores. And this is the departure of Geelong and Katuna on the 20th of October 1914. Health and safety considerations not to the fore, but quite a send-off. And a day later, a large New Zealand convoy arrived in Hobart en route to Albany, where it was to join the Australian convoy that had come round from Melbourne. And the two convoys joined together at Albany and then sailed across the Indian Ocean to the Middle East. This had, I think there were 10 troop ships in this Beatty photograph taken from the dome on this building. 10 troop ships and 5 warships, a very heavy naval escort, including the Japanese battle cruiser Ibuki, which is lying out in the harbour. And these ships departed on the 22nd of October. James Chandler seems to have been photographing ships from about the turn of the century through to the 1940s, captured this view of some of the troop ships heading out down the river and other warships, a couple out there, and others coaling at Prince's Wharf. The river steamer on the left there is Dover, which interestingly during World War II was commandeered for war service and disappeared up to the islands, never to return to Hobart. The movements of vessels in the port during World War I continued to be reported by the Mercury because there was no immediate naval threat once the German East Asiatic Squadron had been eliminated at the end of 1914 at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. But though there was the occasional foray into Australian waters by German merchant raiders. But troop ships came and went, and then as the war drew to a close, we started to see them bringing troops home. And again, they were unusual vessels that we normally wouldn't see. This is Derbyshire of Bibby Line, which normally traded to Burma, bringing troops back to Hobart during the flu epidemic of 1919. And so she had to anchor in Barnes Bay on Bruny Island at the quarantine anchorage. And you can see the other steamer there, there's the interstate passenger vessel Una. All ships had to go into quarantine at Barnes Bay at this time. And the troops eventually were brought up to Hobart by river steamer, like the Excella here. So it was a bit of a downer, if you like, as a welcome home. And they had to hang around down at Barnes Bay for 40 days or whatever before they could come home to meet up with their families. Some of those German vessels that had been seized at the beginning of the war were employed in carrying Allied troops either to the war or back home. And this is the former German Schwakebund, which brought troops home to Hobart in August of 1919. She later was taken over by the Eastern Australian line as the Arafura and was well known here in the 1920s and 30s. Also during the war years, Billy Hughes' government had created the Commonwealth Government line of steamers to operate an Australian flag fleet on the high seas, made up initially of seized German tonnage like Oberhausen, and joined by purchases of British tramp steamers and so on, which were going at a reasonable price. And this is one of those former British tramps, now named Austral Range, and she's seen here in Hobart in October 1919. Although the war's been over for nearly a year, she's still carrying a vestige or a reminder of the conflict in that right up on the bow you can see a rather strange bit of apparatus hanging over the bow, which is part of her paravane or mine cutting equipment. The paravanes were used to cut the cables on mines, and all ships were fitted with them as the war progressed. So the owners hadn't quite got around to getting rid of that particular feature when this photo was taken. This is another Chandler photo too, so he was quite active around about this time. And then we go ahead some years to 1939, and the government, the authorities generally, adopted a very different approach to the outbreak of World War II than they had in 1914. There was far less of the jingoism, if you like, and the patriotism that was expressed in those days. People approached this conflict in a much more subdued way, but also the authorities decided right at the start that they weren't having any nonsense, that they were going to impose security straight away, particularly on the wharves, and also on photographers. So you were encouraged to hand your camera in for the good of the nation. Fortunately, a lot of people didn't, it appears. And one of our former museum members, John Craik, photographed this vessel on the 2nd of September 1939. So the eve of war. I think war broke out the next day, and Australia entered the conflict the day after that. But this is a British vessel, the shell tanker Christa, lying at Ocean Pier, and the crew, in anticipation of what's to come, are out over the side painting the hull grey. So when she sailed, she would have been painted all over. The boys on the bikes were witnesses to history in the making, I guess. And Beattie's studio took this photograph of another tanker on the 20th of October 1939. And it's the Charles F. Mayer, painted grey overall. And the reason they took the photograph was that she was the first ship to use the new Macquarie Point oil berth. Previously, as we saw in that last photo, oil tankers berthed at Ocean Pier, right in Sullivan's Cove, and their petroleum cargoes were carried by pipeline across to the tanks on Macquarie Point. But this was a new oil berth, and henceforth most tankers used it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about these two people over the next few photographs, so I thought might be good to have a look at them. Admittedly 20 years older than they would have been in 1939. This is a photograph of Noel Brown on the left and John Craik on the right, taken at a World Ship Society meeting in Hobart in 1959, I believe. And they were both keen photographers at the outbreak of war and managed somehow or other to secure permits, which allowed them to continue their hobby even though security restrictions were in place. The results of their work over the next few photos. Noel took this one of the Port Brisbane in October 1939, painted grey overall and lying at Ocean Pier. She was one of many port line ships that traded regularly to Hobart and other Australian ports, and that service continued for some time into the war period. She had the misfortune to be sunk on the 21st of November 1940. She was one of many victims of the German commerce raider Penguin, which was arguably one of the most successful German commerce raiders of World War II. Amongst other claims to fame, it laid minefields off Hobart, the entrances to Hobart in Storm Bay and the southern end of the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, on the night of the 31st of October, 1st of November 1940. And having also laid mines in Bass Strait and at various other spots around the coast, one of which claimed the first American merchant ship lost in World War II, the city of Rayville, which hit a mine off Gabo Island and sank around about this time. Penguin went on from here to the Antarctic and captured a whole Norwegian whaling fleet of depot ships and tankers and whale chasers, and most of them managed to get back to Germany with prisoners and supplies. She came to a sticky end off the Seychelles in 1941 when she met up with a far superior, or a much better armed British cruiser.
So that photo you just had up before, that was the German raider, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah. There are very few photos of her, of course, around, nothing that was reproducible here, so I went for that, somebody's put together a digital reproduction. Another photograph that Noel took was of the Nordnes, a Norwegian cargo vessel, on the 2nd of March 1940, about a month before Norway was invaded by the Germans. So at this stage it was a neutral country, and like other neutrals, displayed the national flag and often the name of the ship or whatever on the side of the hull, in the hope that that would deter the stray torpedo from a U-boat or whatever. John Craik took this one of Wellington Star in May 1940. It's a particularly poignant image because she loaded fruit in Hobart to take back to Britain, and on the voyage home she was torpedoed and sunk. A fate that befell many of these ships, of course, particularly as the Battle of the Atlantic became more intense, and there were huge numbers of merchant ship losses. Another fruit ship loading that year was Empire Star, shown departing here on the 6th of April 1940. A dual departure with the Sydney-Hobart passenger liner Zealandia also backing out into the stream at the same time. It's an interesting photo in that the British ship is painted all over grey, and actually we can't see it there, but it would have had a gun mounted on the stern for defensive purposes, whereas Zealandia is carrying on as if nothing's happening. She's still painted in normal peacetime colours and so on. She continued on the Sydney-Hobart passenger run until June of 1940, so she was off the run a couple of months after this, and returned in January 1941 to take Tasmanian troops to Sydney. So this is the departure from Queen's Pier in Hobart. But she's still painted in peacetime colours. Zealandia also came to a sticky end, unfortunately. She was caught in the Japanese raid on Darwin, was bombed and sunk there. Another one of John Craik's photos. He could easily have been mistaken for a German spy in taking this, because he's obviously been hiding around the corner of the shed to photograph the stern gun on the blue funnel liner Orestes. But perhaps more important are the oil tanks on Macquarie Point in the background, which would have been very much a strategic location and target in the event of attack. The permit that he and Noel had didn't extend to Risdon for obvious reasons. That was very much an off-limits strategic site. But in typical fashion, and this says something about the Australian attitude to authority, I think, it didn't stop them from occasionally going out in a small boat and pretending to be fishing, I suppose, and taking a photograph of a ship alongside the Risdon wharf. And this is City of Edinburgh, loading zinc for Britain on the 16th of January 1940. They tried it again some time later and were caught, marched ashore, and had their permits revoked, presumably the film taken from their camera and so on, and they both decided that if they were deprived of their favourite pastime, they might as well join up. So Noel joined the Air Force and John the Armoured Corps, and we don't see any more photos taken by them for the rest of the war, unfortunately. There were other people doing a similar job though, including Hal Wyatt, who was a member of this museum many years ago and of the Ship Lovers Society. And Hal somehow or other, although he didn't have a permit, managed to get quite a few photographs of ships around the waterfront, quite blatantly in this case, of a number of auxiliary minesweepers. These are, we've just got the stern of HMAS Durroween at the left, and then HMAS Corowa and HMAS Bombo. The initial letters on the hull are a good reminder of the names. But they were here somewhere around 1941-42, and certainly there were minesweepers here when Penguin laid her mines, because they were detected and swept very quickly. So we fortunately had no casualties as a result of those. During 1941, Hobart was visited on 3 occasions by the Cunard liner Queen Mary and twice by Queen Elizabeth, then the 2 largest merchant ships in the world. And it's amazing how many photographs of these vessels there are around. It seems like just everybody who had a camera in Hobart took a photograph of one or other or both of them at some time. And this one's been taken from, I'm not sure where from.
Princess Park.
Princess Park, thank you, Peter. Yes. Looking out to the Queen Mary anchored in the stream. They anchored off Belrive, so they weren't exactly invisible. But nonetheless, you weren't supposed to photograph them. However, the Tasmanian Government Railways obviously saw some business opportunity in the visits of these vessels, because although they don't mention it, this particular advertisement appeared about the time I think the Queen Elizabeth happened to be in Hobart. So you can imagine that she was probably one of those opportunities that encouraging people from outside Hobart to come to the city and have a look at. And there's Queen Elizabeth anchored in the stream, taken from the bottom of Finlay Street, Battery Point. That's the Port Huon fruit juices factory over on the left. And another one, obviously somebody got fairly close in a small boat and photographed the river steamer Mongana, which was acting as a tender to the Queen Elizabeth on one of her 2 visits in 1941. Incidentally, some people will tell you that both these ships were in Hobart together, but they never were, because that would have defeated the whole purpose of the exercise. They were actually engaged in the troop shuttle from Sydney to the Middle East, and it was thought best that if one of them was in Sydney, that the other one was well away from there, and the best deep water port was Hobart. So if one was here, the other one was in Sydney. And they did almost cross over on the last visit. On their last visits, the Queen Mary was here on the 16th of October 1941 and sailed a couple of days later, and Queen Elizabeth arrived on the 25th. So there was a bit of a gap between them. Mongana was one of several river steamers that were requisitioned for war service by either the Australian or the American authorities, particularly as the Pacific War progressed and the island campaign began. These small vessels were particularly useful for carrying stores and troops and so on between the islands. I mentioned earlier that Dover was taken, and Dolphin was another one, I think, that left here never to return. And Mongana didn't come back either. She ended the war in Sydney and was broken up there eventually. But this is her being fitted out at Battery Point in probably 1943, late 1942, early 43, ready for war service. Now, I apologise, I don't have a photograph of the Japanese submarine I-25, which came into Great Oyster Bay on the east coast in March 1942, 1st of March 1942, and flew off a seaplane, or unloaded a seaplane into the water, which then flew over Hobart. And this was the pilot, Nobuo Fujita, and he survived the war and recorded later that he flew down the east coast and around behind Mount Wellington, and then over the zinc works and down the river and back out to sea and up the east coast. And he repeated this exercise in Melbourne, Sydney, Wellington, Auckland and Suva. So he was a very lucky man, or it says something about our defences even at such a critical time of the war, when Japanese invasion of Australia anyway was thought to be imminent. There is a story, and I'm sure it is only a story, that when he flew over the zinc works, the military detachment at Dowsing's Point suddenly realised that the plane had Japanese markings and scrambled to man the guns, but they couldn't find the person who had the key to the ammunition locker. So anyway, Fujita went on to be the first person, so far, fortunately the only person, to ever drop a bomb on the United States. And he later in 1942, he was sent. His submarine was sent to the west coast of the US, and he was detailed to drop incendiaries on the forests of the northwest to start bushfires and create civilian panic. Nothing happened. None of the incendiaries actually did what they were supposed to do, so nothing happened. But again, he survived. Hal Wyatt managed to get this photo of very murky photograph from round about Edward Street on the Glebe, I think. Looks like the uni, the old uni there on the left. But the subject of the photograph is that three-funnel liner in the stream, the Ile-de-France, which had called into Hobart on the 5th of November 1942, berthed at Ocean Pier, and she became at that time the largest merchant ship ever to actually berth in Hobart, to come alongside a wharf in Hobart, a record that was held until I think Oriana came here in 1961.
How many tonnes, Rex?
About 43,000, somewhere around that, Peter. Yeah. And as far as I know, that is the only photograph, well, it's certainly the only photograph I've ever seen of her visit to Hobart. So we're indebted to Hal for at least that murky image, which has a certain charm about it anyway. Hal worked for part of the war, at least, in the telephone exchange up on Harrington Street, looking out over St David's Park. And so he was able to take some photographs from there, as was a workmate, Melville Muir, who took this photo of the Dutch liner New Amsterdam arriving in Hobart as a troop ship in October 1943. Sorry, July 1943. She actually came here twice that month for ferrying troops from New Zealand, and they called into Hobart for stores, etc. And this is another view of her. I don't know who this was taken by, but looking down Hunter Street with the Jones & Co factory on the left to Ocean Pier and the New Amsterdam lying alongside with a warship, a naval escort on the north side of the pier. And over on the right, an American Liberty ship. We'll talk a little bit more about those shortly, but one of, I think, 195 that visited Hobart in 1943-44. And a couple of more romantic visitors, if you like. In June 1942, the bark Kyalani arrived in Hobart and seen here at Prince's Wharf with the old Hobart Bobby and his helmet. The Kyalani was on her way from South Africa to New Zealand with munitions, and was brought into Hobart because some of the crew considered her unseaworthy. Some of those crew were university students who had opted for service in deep sea sailing ships as an alternative to military service. And one of them was Carl Cortum, who later went on to found the San Francisco Maritime Museum. A photograph of him here. Colin, I'll rely on your memory here. I think he's in this photograph. I've got a feeling he's the guy with the glasses. 1 second from the left.
I can't remember which one he is, but he's there.
Yeah. So these were some of those uni students and some of the regular crew aboard Kyalani. Anyway, we have copies of Carl Cortum's diaries in the museum from his time in Hobart, and tells us a lot about what happened with the Kyalani and so on. In short, the students who were the ones who had forced the captain to bring the ship into Hobart because they thought it was unseaworthy were charged with mutiny and were put in the Hobart jail until they were released by a local lawyer on a writ of habeas corpus, and then some of them were under house arrest for a time at Session, second home of the Maritime Museum, and they helped to enlarge the cellars there as payment for their board and lodging. And eventually Kyalani's cargo was unloaded into another ship, and she was towed up to Sydney by the tug James Wallace, and then went up to the islands, from which she never returned. But while she was here, the local director of navigation, Captain Bull, went aboard and had a good look at her. He shimmied up the masts and out on the spars and so on, and he decided that she wasn't going anywhere. She was in a very bad state. And so he was instrumental in keeping her here for some time. There were also various activities on board, including the local Sea Scouts were taken aboard for a day and helped to scrub the decks, swab the decks, and so on, as seen in this photo. By this time she was lying out in the stream and waiting to be towed to Sydney. And we also had a visit from the bark Law Hill. She came here twice in July 1943 and July 1945 with cocoa beans for Cadbury's from South Africa. And she was under the South African flag, having been taken over from her Finnish owners when Finland joined the Axis powers in the shifting alliances of the war. But her Finnish master and some of the crew remained on board, and the master's wife and daughter were also aboard on both these visits. And some local boys joined the crew as well in Hobart. We have the diary of Bill Broughton, I think, in our collection. Journey of a Man, it's called, and includes his time on the Law Hill. When she sailed from Hobart after VJ Day in September 1945, she was photographed by the then manager of Kodak, Eric Long. He went out on one of the river steamers and followed her down the river and took this colour slide of her off Taroona as she was putting up some sail and heading out to sea to go to Sydney. So a very early example of Kodachrome slides taken by a man who presumably was in the right job to be able to get hold of it at that time. I think this is another Beatty photo. In 1943, the Hobart Bridge, the first floating bridge, was opened. And this is a good view of Hollyman's coastal trader Lenina, which was on the Melbourne-Hobart run throughout the war, painted grey by now, and with a stern gun, going through the lift span. She was the first ship to go through the lift span of the floating bridge. This is on the 4th of October 1943. The rest of the bridge is not in place at this stage. That was to happen a few weeks later. And here we can see the pontoons, the concrete caissons being moved into downriver to be connected together and form the completed bridge. This photo taken on the 21st of October 1943. And the ships are here on the extreme right is the dredger William Pitt. On the other side, the Bellerive Vehicular Ferry Lurgarina. And down the other end, one of the two big Bellerive ferries, Rosny or Derwent, and I think the Melba in the centre of the other three ships. And either side of her are two naval vessels, HMAS Ganambi, a converted trawler, and on the other side, the bigger vessel, HMAS Coombar, converted coastal trader, one of a number of naval vessels that were based in Hobart during the war years. And she was the last one, actually, here at the end of the war. Back to Melville Muir and the telephone exchange for a minute. Another photograph of his is this one of the American troopship Brazil. And there's a little story attached to this one as well from the museum's viewpoint, in that in the early 2000s we received a visit from a couple, an American couple, who had brought the ashes of the husband's father to Hobart to be scattered on the Derwent. And apparently he had been amongst the troops aboard Brazil on this visit to Hobart in August 1943. They'd been here for a few days and he'd always remembered Hobart very fondly. And in his latter days he made his family promise that if at all possible they would scatter his ashes here. And so they came to the museum to ask if we knew anything about the Brazil and where it birthed. and we did. The manager of the museum, Jeff Gordon, took them out in his yacht, and they were able to scatter the ashes just off the approximate location of Ocean Pier, roughly where the cruise terminal is today at Macquarie Wharf. So it was a good news story. And Melville also photographed what was then the biggest warship to berth in Hobart, the USS Saratoga, American carrier that was operating with the British fleet in the Indian Ocean and around into the Pacific. And again, a little story attached to it. When she arrived here, the harbour master went out, Captain MacArthur went out and said he would bring her into Ocean Pier, but Hobart, of course, didn't have any tugs in those days, and the captain, or the commander of the ship, was aghast and said, "I need 5 tugs to berth this vessel." And Captain MacArthur said, "Well, it's your choice. You either stay in the river or I take it in." And he did. And he didn't demolish anything in the process. So it was an amazing example of what these experienced mariners could do. And again, of course, there are photographs of her, quite a few photographs around. And she was arguably the largest warship to berth here. HMS Hood is also in the running, but it depends which measurement you use. One is slightly bigger in tonnage, and the other one's slightly longer. So, you can take your pick on that one. Anyway, she was a big ship by the standards of the day.
She's bow out too, Rex. She was bow out?
Bow in. Bow in.
Really?
Yeah. Not quite so obvious in that photo, but she was, yeah. The Mercury even took photographs of her, actually, which they didn't publish till after the war, of course. But again, in December 1944, we had a hostile visitor, U-862, German U-boat, which had been based in the Far East and was returning home as the European situation deteriorated for Germany. But the commander got leave to do a cruise around Australia and New Zealand to see if he could sink any commercial shipping. He, having had an altercation with a Greek cargo vessel off Adelaide, in which he came off second best, he decided to come round the south of Tasmania and avoid Bass Strait because the Navy were out looking for him. He was off Storm Bay on the 15th of December 44. And there's a book about this called U-Boat Far From Home, based on the logs and memories of that time. And they were reported to have seen an American tanker, the Forbes Road, leaving Hobart and wanted to attack it. But they had a shortage of torpedoes, so could only attack on the surface using the gun. And as luck would have it, there was an aircraft flying around, so they had to submerge to escape detection. And the tanker likewise escaped destruction. We mentioned the Liberty ships earlier, 195 visits to Hobart by ships of this type in 1943-44. There were nearly 3,000 of them built, and they were part of the emergency shipbuilding program in World War II at a time when, certainly in the Battle of the Atlantic, merchant ships were being sunk by German U-boats faster than they could be built. And the American solution to that typically was, we'll build them faster than they could be sunk. And so they went into mass production with components built in factories all over the United States, brought together by the rail network to specially built shipyards where they were welded together. First major use of welding on ships to that time. And then dispatched overseas. One of them, the Frank E. Peary, I think, holds the world shipbuilding record of 5.5 days from laying of the keel to launching. So that would have been quite amazing. If you'd had a camera in place and still photography, you would have seen a ship take shape in front of you. And she was launched with the engines in, so all she had to do was do a quick fit out and away. And that was pretty typical of the shipbuilding effort. And the reason Hobart saw a number of them was that many that were built in on the Pacific coast of the US, California and so on, came down the coast of South America, the west coast of South America, and cut across south of New Zealand on their way to India and beyond. And Hobart was a convenient port of call to take on stores, do repairs, that sort of thing. And local engineering firms like Johnson Brothers and so on got quite a bit of business out of them in terms of patching up lifeboats and even more serious repairs. And this is a photo of one of the shipyards in the US, just showing the number of vessels that were being constructed at any one time. And here's, unfortunately, the photographer here is unknown, but these are two of the Liberties coming into Hobart in 1943-44. Sometimes they arrived 9 or 10 at a time, and they would come up the river like ducklings. So the pilot would be aboard the first ship and the rest would just follow, and they would go into the various berths around the port or at anchor in the stream. Coming to war's end, another famous liner, the Empress of Scotland, had been Empress of Japan but was renamed for obvious reasons, and is here in Hobart in January 1945 with New Zealand troops on their way to the Pacific. And just over, it's not obvious in this photograph, but on the extreme left there is the stern of a warship, which is HMNZS Achilles, formerly HMS Achilles, one of the cruisers that helped to sink the German pocket battleship Graf Spee at the Battle of the River Plate in 1939. No, sorry. And towards the end of the war now, April 1945, and an unknown photographer took this particular shot from Bellerive, looking out over the bay, and this is an enlarged version of the photo, which is much more panoramic. It shows the British cargo liner Essex alongside Ocean Pier, and just over her bows, a bit hard to pick up, but on the other side of the pier are two squat funnels of a motor ship, which turns out to be the troopship Highland Princess. And that was the way in which the photograph could be dated, in fact, from her. But Essex had a rough war. She was in the Malta convoys and was so badly damaged in one of them that she was out of action for nearly 3 years, and had only just come back into service when she did this visit to Hobart to load fruit. And with the war over, warships, particularly British vessels attached to the British Pacific Fleet, could call at Hobart in peacetime conditions, and many of them did, including a number of battleships, often on their way home, back to England to decommission. But this one, HMS Vindex, an escort carrier, an aircraft carrier built from a merchant hull, had been laid down as a port line ship, the Port Melbourne, I think. and converted to a carrier for the North Atlantic. And she brought the new governor, Sir Hugh Binney, to Hobart to take up service here, take up office here, and also brought back a lot of Tasmanian troops. And I remember talking to one of them once about, he said, they all slept on the flight deck. The governor had a cabin down below, of course, but they all slept on the flight deck, and it was the worst trip he's ever experienced, coming across Bass Strait. And Vindex, after the war, will end on a happy note. Having survived the war, she was converted back to her original form as a refrigerated cargo liner. But instead of being renamed Port Melbourne, she was, in honour of her war service, she became the Port Vindex. And as such, links to a much later period in ship photography in Hobart, the 1960s and 70s, when this port was home to a veritable tribe of ship photographers, of which I became one around about 1960. So, and that's my photograph of her in Hobart in the early the late 1960s. I think she was scrapped in 1971. And on that note, I think we can conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever. Thank you.